Welcome to Sleepy Legends, where stories from the past unfold in the quiet hours of the night. I'm very glad you're here. Tonight we travel to the ancient world of the Near East, to a time of stone cities and starlit skies, when wisdom was treasured as deeply as gold and stories were passed down in whispers and songs. We journey to Jerusalem, to the reign of a king remembered not for conquest, but for understanding. A king whose name became synonymous with insight, patience, and the quiet power of listening. Tonight's legend is the story of King Solomon, a ruler who chose wisdom over wealth, discernment over dominance, and whose legacy lives on in scripture, poetry, and myth. This is a story of dreams and judgments, temples and teachings, and the gentle weight of knowledge carried across a lifetime. Before we begin our journey, if you enjoy these slow, peaceful tales from mythology and history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep Sleepy Legends alive and growing. And if there's a myth, legend, or historical figure you'd like to rest with in a future episode, feel free to leave a comment below. I read every single one. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and allow the night to carry us gently into the world of King Solomon. The night settles over ancient stone like a soft blanket being drawn across the world. Above the hills, the sky deepens from dusty purple to indigo, then to that particular darkness that belongs only to nights far from our time. Stars emerge, one by one, patient as they've always been. They've watched these hills for thousands of years. They're watching still. The air here moves differently than it does in our time. It's thicker somehow, carrying the warmth of sun-baked limestone even now, hours after sunset. This air that smells of olive with smoke, of clay dust settling, of something green and growing in hidden gardens. The temperature has dropped just enough to be pleasant, just enough to make cloaks draw a little closer, to make movement a little slower, to let the day finally fall away. Below, the city rests on its hill, Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem, a city of terraced stone, of walls within walls, of buildings that seem to grow from the rock itself, as if they'd always been there, as if human hands simply revealed what the earth had been holding all along. The limestone glows faintly in the starlight, pale gold, cream, the color of old parchment. Every stone was cut by hand. Every wall was built by hands that have long since returned to dust. But the stones remain. They remember the touch of those hands. They remember everything. The sounds of the day have faded. The merchants have packed away their colored fabrics, their spices, their copper vessels. The artisans have set down their tools. The gates have been closed. They're heavy with sealed against the night. What remains now is only the gentlest whisper of a city at rest. Somewhere, a dove coos softly from its roost, that drowsy, murmuring sound that doves make when they settle their feathers for sleep. Somewhere, water moves through a hidden channel, trickling from the spring below the city. That same spring that has fed this place since before memory. Its steady flow like a pulse, like a heartbeat that never stops. And somewhere, closer now, oil lamps flicker in windows carved deep into stone walls. These lamps burn with a warm, honey-colored light, olive oil, carefully poured, feeding a small flame that dances and sways but never quite goes out. The light they cast is gentle, forgiving. It softens every edge, makes shadows into velvet, turns ordinary rooms into caves of amber light where time seems to pool and slow and almost stop. In one of these rooms, high above the city, a lamp burns beside a window. The window is wide, opening onto the night without glass, without barrier, just an archway of smooth stone framing the darkness and the stars. A faint breeze moves through, carrying the scent of night-blooming flowers from the gardens below. Jasmine, perhaps, or honeysuckle, something sweet that only releases its perfume after the sun has gone. The room itself is simple, though built of the finest materials. Cedar beams cross the ceiling. They were dark and fragrant even after all these years. The floor is smooth stone, cool beneath bare feet. Cushions rest against the walls, deep blue, crimson, woven with patterns of gold thread that catch the lamplight when the air moves them. And in this room, there is stillness. The kind of stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from quiet fullness, from presence, from someone who has learned how to be completely, restfully still. A man sits here by the window, looking out at his city, not standing at attention, not pacing, not worrying, just sitting. His robes fall in soft folds around him, the fabric fine but simple. His hands rest quietly in his lap. His breathing is slow, easy, matching the rhythm of the night itself. He has been king of this city for many years now. He has built and judged and ruled and decided. He has listened to countless voices, settled countless disputes, carried the weight of countless decisions. He has been called the wisest man in all the world, and perhaps he is. But wisdom, real wisdom, knows when to set down the weight of the day. And so he sits, watching the stars over Jerusalem, while the night holds everything for a while. The stone is cool. The lamp is warm. The night stretches out, long and patient and kind. The man at the window carries a name that echoes through time. Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. But before he was any of these things, he was a boy who watched and listened. His father, David, had been a different kind of king. A shepherd who became a warrior, a poet who became a ruler, a young man with a sling who grew into someone who united scattered tribes into a single kingdom. David's reign had been one of transformation, of borders established, of enemies turned into allies or defeated, of a small nation becoming something larger, something that mattered in the world of empires and powers. But that is not the story being told tonight. Tonight is not about conquests or crowns won in youth. Tonight is about what comes after. About the son who inherited not a kingdom to build, but a kingdom to keep, to nurture, to make wise. Solomon had been born into a house that hummed with activity. The palace in Jerusalem, smaller then, simpler than the one that would come later, was always full of voices. Advisors conferring in corners, messengers arriving with news from distant towns, scribes bent over their work, their reed pens scratching across papyrus, recording everything, preserving everything. As a boy, Solomon had moved through these rooms like a shadow. He watched the scribes form their letters, the ancient characters that held the weight of law and history and prayer. He listened to the counselors debate, their voices rising and falling like music, each man certain of his position, each argument carefully constructed. He observed his father in the evening hours, when David would set aside the concerns of the kingdom and take up his lyre, his fingers finding melodies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the palace walls, beyond the city, beyond the visible world entirely. David had been many things: warrior, king, psalmist. But in his later years, in the years when Solomon was old enough to truly see him, David had become quieter, more reflective. The energy that had driven him to build a kingdom had turned inward, toward questions that had no easy answers. What does it mean to rule well? What does it mean to serve something larger than yourself? What does a man leave behind when his time is done? Solomon absorbed these questions without being asked. He felt them in the silences between his father's words. He sensed them in the way David would pause sometimes, mid-sentence, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. The palace had a rhythm, and Solomon learned to move with it. Morning prayers in the cool dawn air, the words of ancient blessings spoken by men who had spoken them their entire lives. Afternoon meetings in shaded courtyards where decisions were made slowly, carefully, with consideration for what ripples they might send into the future. Evening meals where stories were told, stories of their ancestors, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, of the long journey from Egypt, of the covenant that bound them to something eternal. He learned that leadership was not only about strength, it was about patience, about listening more than speaking, about understanding that every choice carried weight, that every word could build up or tear down, that the true measure of a king was not in how much territory he controlled, but in how much wisdom he cultivated. The inheritance that came to Solomon was not simply land and throne and crown. It was responsibility. It was the accumulated hopes of a people who had wandered for generations before finding this land, who had struggled and survived and now needed someone to help them continue. It was the unspoken expectation that he would be worthy of what had been given to him. Some inheritances are heavy even when they're precious. Solomon felt this weight even as a young man, but he did not resist it. He did not resent it. Instead, he grew quiet with it, the way a tree grows strong by standing steady against the wind. And now, years later, sitting by his window in the stillness of night, he carries that weight with the ease of long practice. It has shaped him, made him who he is. The boy who watched has become the man who sees. The air has become the keeper of something worth keeping. Outside, the stars will slowly overhead. Inside, the lamp burns on. There had been a journey early in Solomon's reign, a journey to a place called Gibeon, where the old altar stood, the high place where his people had worshipped before the temple was built, before Jerusalem became the center of everything. It was a sacred site, ancient even then, a place where the boundary between earth and heaven seemed thinner somehow. The journey itself had been slow, not the hurried march of an army, not the efficient travel of messengers with urgent news. This was a pilgrimage, and pilgrimages are not meant to be rushed. Solomon had traveled with a small company, priests and servants, a few trusted advisors, moving at the pace of contemplation rather than urgency. They had walked through the hill country as the sun climbed, and fell and climbed again. Past terrace vineyards where grapes hung heavy on the vine. Past olive groves where the silver-green leaves whispered in the breeze. Past small villages where people stopped their work to watch the young king pass, their hands raised in blessing, their faces curious and hopeful. The dust of the road had settled on Solomon's robes. The sun had warmed his shoulders. The rhythm of walking, step after step after step, had emptied his mind of the clutter of the palace, the endless decisions and disputes and demands. By the time they reached Gibeon, he felt hollowed out in a good way, like a vessel waiting to be filled. The altar at Gibeon was built of unhewn stones, as the old law required. Stones that had never been touched by iron tools, never been shaped by human ambition into something other than what they were. They stood there, rough and honest, piled into a place of offering. Solomon had brought 1,000 burnt offerings, 1,000, an extravagant number, a number that spoke of devotion and seeking and need. Through the long afternoon and into the evening, the priests had made the sacrifices. The smoke had risen, column after column, ascending into the dimming sky. The smell of burning cedar and myrrh and roasted grain had filled the air, thick and sweet and sacred. Solomon had stood and watched and prayed, not with elaborate words, not with speeches meant to impress, just simple, honest prayer, the kind that comes from deep places, from the part of the soul that knows it doesn't have all the answers. When the last sacrifice had been made, when the sun had finally set and the stars had begun to appear, Solomon had lain down to sleep near the altar. The ground was hard beneath him. The night air was cool on his face. Around him, the priests and servants had settled into their own rest, their breathing gradually slowing, their bodies surrendering to the exhaustion of the day's journey and the long hours of ceremony. Solomon closed his eyes, and in that space between waking and sleeping, in that threshold place where the boundaries of the self grow soft and permeable, something happened. A presence filled the darkness behind his eyes. Not a voice at first, just a sense of vastness, of being seen completely, known utterly. Held in an awareness so large and so gentle that there was no room for fear in it. Only awe, only wonder. Then the voice came. It was not loud. It did not boom or thunder or command. It was quiet, the way truth is quiet, the way certainty is quiet. It filled everything without forcing anything. Ask, the voice said. What shall I give you? The question hung in the darkness like a star. What shall I give you? What do you want? What do you need? If you could have anything, anything at all, what would you choose? Solomon, still suspended in that space between sleep and waking, felt the weight of the question. He was young. He was king of a people who expected so much from him. He was the son of a man who had been larger than life, and now that man was gone, and Solomon was left to fill a space that seemed impossibly large. He could have asked for a long life, for health that would never fail, for strength to outlast all his enemies. He could have asked for wealth beyond measure, for treasures from every nation, for gold and silver piled high in storehouses that never emptied. He could have asked for victory over all who opposed him, for military might, for the power to crush anyone who dared to challenge his rule. But these things felt small, somehow, temporary, like grasping at shadows. What Solomon needed, what he truly needed, was something else entirely. "I am young," he said, and his voice in the dream was quiet, honest. "I am like a little child. I don't know how to go out or come in before this people. They are so many, too many to count. How can I govern them? How can I judge between good and evil, between right and wrong, when the choices are so complex and the consequences reach so far?" He paused, and in the pause, he felt his own insufficiency like a physical thing. Not shame exactly, just clear-eyed recognition of the gap between what was required and what he possessed. "Give me," he said slowly, each word chosen with care, an understanding heart. "Give me wisdom to judge your people. Give me discernment to know the difference between good and evil. Give me the ability to truly hear what is being said, to see what is really happening, to perceive the truth beneath the surface of things." He was asking not for power over others, but for power over himself. Not for the ability to impose his will, but for the ability to align his will with what was right and true and good. "Give me a listening heart," he said again, the request turning like a jewel in his mind, showing different facets. "Give me the wisdom to lead well, to serve faithfully, to be worthy of what has been entrusted to me." The presence surrounding him seemed to grow warmer, closer, and the voice, when it came again, carried something that might have been pleasure, or approval, or the deep satisfaction of being truly understood. "Because you have asked for this," the voice said slowly, letting each word settle. "Because you have not asked for long life, or for riches, or for the death of your enemies, but have asked for understanding and discernment. Because of this, I will give you what you have asked for." The promise unfolded gradually, like a flower opening. "I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before, and there will be no one like you after. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime, no other king will compare to you." The blessing poured over Solomon like warm oil, like light, like water in a dry land. Not all at once, but steadily, filling every empty space. He felt it settling into him, becoming part of him, a gift that would shape everything that followed. When he woke in the morning, the sun was already rising over Gibeon. The priests were stirring. The altar stone stood silent and patient in the early light. But Solomon was changed. He carried something now that he hadn't carried before. He carried wisdom, and it would be enough. The throne room in Jerusalem was built of the same pale limestone as the rest of the city. Light entered through high windows, slanting down in dusty beams that made the air itself visible. The floor was smooth stone, worn by countless feet. Petitioners and officials, merchants and farmers, anyone who had a dispute that needed settling, a question that needed answering, a problem that required the king's attention. Solomon sat on his throne, carved from imported wood and inlaid with ivory. But he sat simply without ceremony. His hands rested on the armrests. His posture was relaxed but attentive. He had the look of someone who was fully present, completely there, not distracted by what had happened earlier or what would happen later. Before him stood two women. They were young, both of them. Their clothes were simple, worn from work and washing. Their faces showed the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for infants, the kind of tired that settles into the bones and doesn't leave. They stood apart from each other, not touching. Each one wrapped in her own grief and desperation. Each woman held a child. One child was alive, squirming and fussing in its mother's arms. The other child was still, wrapped carefully in cloth, its small body quiet in a way that bodies should not be quiet. The women had come with a story that was also a question, a problem that seemed to have no solution. They lived in the same house, they explained. They had given birth within days of each other, both bringing sons into the world. Both had been alone with their babies through the nights. No husbands, no family to help, just the two of them caring for their children in the intimate exhaustion of new motherhood. And then one night, one of the babies had died. The women spoke in turns, their voices overlapping, interrupting, each trying to be heard. One said that the other had rolled onto her child in the night, smothering him accidentally in sleep, and then had switched the babies in the darkness, taking the living child and leaving the dead one. The other said no, that was her son, the living one. She would know her own child, wouldn't she? A mother knows. A mother always knows. But both women said the same thing. Both claimed the living child. Both insisted with equal passion, equal certainty, equal desperation. Solomon listened. He watched their faces as they spoke. He noticed which one looked at the living child and which one looked at him. He observed the trembling in their hands, the catch in their voices, the way grief and fear and love all tangled together into something that made rational argument impossible. This was not a matter of evidence. There were no witnesses, no proof, just two women and two very different stories, and one living child who could not speak for himself. The court had grown quiet. The officials and scribes who usually murmured among themselves had fallen silent, waiting to see what the young king would do. This was not a question of law or precedent. This was a question of truth, and truth can be slippery when everyone believes they are telling it. Solomon sat very still for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice calm, almost casual. "Bring me a sword," he said. A servant moved quickly, returning with a blade that caught the light from the windows. Solomon gestured toward the living child. "This child is claimed by both women," he said slowly, thoughtfully. "Neither will yield. Neither will compromise. So let us be fair. Let us divide the child in two. Give half to one woman and half to the other. That way, neither can claim to have won, and neither can claim to have lost." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. One of the women, the one who had been standing slightly back, her arms empty of the living child, nodded quickly. "Yes," she said, her voice hard with pain. "Let him be neither mine nor yours. Divide him." But the other woman, the one holding the living baby, cried out. Her whole body reacted as if she had been struck. "No," she said, and the word was ragged, desperate. "No, please. Give her the child. Let him live. Don't harm him. Just let him live." She was willing to lose everything. Her claim, her son, her future, if it meant the child would survive. Her love was larger than her need to possess. Her desire for the child's life was stronger than her desire to be called his mother. Solomon raised his hand, and the servant with the sword stepped back. "Give the living child to the woman who would spare him," Solomon said quietly. "She is his mother." The true mother took her son back into her arms, tears streaming down her face. The other woman stood silent, her deception revealed not by evidence, but by the simple architecture of love. What it protects, what it prioritizes, what it's willing to sacrifice. The court exhaled. The officials nodded to each other. Word of the judgment would spread through Jerusalem by nightfall, carried on the tongues of those who had witnessed it. The king was wise. The king could see. The king knew how to listen not just to words, but to what lay beneath them. Under Solomon's hand, the kingdom settled into something it had never quite been before. Peace. Not the temporary quiet between wars, not the exhausted stillness after conflict, but real peace, lasting peace, the kind that allows people to plant vineyards knowing they will be there to harvest the grapes. The kind that lets children grow up without learning to be afraid of distant armies. The kind that turns a nation's energy away from survival and towards something richer, deeper, more enduring. The borders were secure. Treaties had been signed with neighboring kingdoms, Egypt to the south, Tyre to the north, distant nations to the east. These were not treaties born of conquest, but of mutual benefit. Agreements that recognize the value of trade over conflict, of exchange over domination. And so the trade routes opened. Caravans began to flow through Solomon's kingdom like blood through a body, bringing life and wealth and wonder. From the south came merchants with their camels loaded high, gold dust from Ophir, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. Exotic spices that made food taste like celebration. From the north came the ships of Hiram of Tyre, their holds filled with cedar and cypress from the mountains of Lebanon. Fine purple cloth dyed with the rare extract of sea snails, bronze work crafted by master artisans whose skills have been passed down through generations. From the east came ivory and precious stones, jade and lapis lazuli, silk that flowed like water through the fingers. From the west came grain and oil, pottery and glasswork, items both practical and beautiful. The everyday necessities and the occasional luxury that makes life feel like more than mere survival. Jerusalem grew wealthy not through plunder, but through position. It sat at the crossroads of empires, a natural meeting place for traders who needed to move goods between Africa and Asia, between the Mediterranean coast and the distant lands beyond the desert. Solomon understood this. He taxed fairly, kept the roads safe, ensured that merchants could pass through his land without fear of bandits or corrupt officials. The wealth that came from this trade flowed into the kingdom like a gentle, constant stream. It built storehouses that held grain against future famines. It paid skilled workers to construct buildings that would last for generations. It supported scribes and scholars, musicians and poets, craftsmen who had the time and resources to perfect their arts. In the villages and towns of Israel, daily life took on a rhythm that felt almost like music. Farmers worked their terraced fields, coaxing wheat and barley from the rocky soil. Shepherds guided their flocks through the hill country, moving with the seasons, knowing which valleys held the sweetest grass, which springs ran clear even in summer. Fishermen on the Sea of Galilee cast their nets in the early morning light and drew them in heavy with the night's catch. Women ground grain into flour, baked bread in clay ovens, wove cloth on wooden looms, their hands moving in patterns learned from their mothers and grandmothers. Children played in the streets and courtyards, their laughter rising like birdsong. Elders sat in the shade of fig trees and told stories, keeping the past alive in the present. In Jerusalem itself, the city hummed with creative energy. Scholars gathered in the hall Solomon had built for them, debating the finer points of law and history, copying ancient texts onto fresh papyrus, preserving the wisdom of their ancestors while adding to it their own observations and insights. They studied the natural world, the behavior of animals, the properties of plants, the movements of stars, not as separate from faith, but as another way of understanding the mind of the Creator. Musicians composed new songs on lyres and harps, on drums and cymbals and flutes. Some of these songs were prayers set to melody. Others were love songs, work songs, songs to celebrate harvests or mourn losses. Music filled the temple courts during festivals, filled the streets during celebrations, filled homes in the evening when families gathered after the day's labor. Artisans worked in their workshops, creating objects of both beauty and function. Potters shaped clay on spinning wheels, their hands knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, how to coax the wet earth into vessels that could hold water or wine or oil. Metalworkers hammered bronze and iron into tools and ornaments, their forges glowing hot, even in the coolest weather. Stone carvers transformed rough blocks into pillars and decorative elements, into bowls and lampstands and small figures that captured something of the human form or the animal world. Weavers created tapestries that told stories in thread, geometric patterns that pleased the eye, representations of pomegranates and lilies and palms, borders worked in gold and scarlet and royal blue. Jewelers set precious stones into settings of gold and silver, creating pieces that caught the light and held it, that transformed something of the earth into something that spoke of celebration and permanence. The kingdom was not without its problems. There were still disputes to settle, still injustices to correct, still the everyday difficulties of human beings trying to live together in limited space with limited resources. But these were manageable problems, the kind that could be addressed through wisdom rather than force. Solomon had given his people something precious, the space to flourish, the freedom to develop skills beyond survival, the opportunity to create beauty, to pursue knowledge, to live not just to see another day, but to make each day worth living. The Golden Age was not called golden because of the metal that filled the treasury. It was golden because of the light that filled the people's days, because of the sense that life could be more than struggle, because of the peace that allowed every person to become a little more fully who they were meant to be. And at the center of it all, Solomon continued to rule with the wisdom he had asked for, listening, perceiving, judging with fairness, creating the conditions in which his people could rest and grow and thrive. There had been a dream within Solomon's heart for as long as he had been king. His father David had wanted to build it, a permanent dwelling place for the sacred objects of Israel, a house worthy of the presence they believed dwelt among them. But David had been a man of war, his hands stained with the necessities of nation building, and the task had been set aside for a different time, a different king. For Solomon, the planning had begun years before the first stone was laid. Solomon had sat with architects and priests, with craftsmen and advisors, working out every detail. This would not be a building thrown up quickly to meet an immediate need. This would be a structure that embodied everything his people believed about order and beauty, about the relationship between heaven and earth, about the care required when creating space for the sacred. The proportions mattered. Every measurement carried meaning. The temple would be 60 cubits long, roughly 90 feet by the measure of a man's forearm, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. These numbers were not arbitrary. They spoke of harmony, of relationships that pleased both the eye and the mind, of dimensions that felt right in a way that went beyond simple utility. The building would face east, toward the rising sun. It would be divided into 3 sections: an outer porch, a main hall, and an inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would rest in sacred darkness. Each space would lead to the next, a progression from the public to the private, from the accessible to the forbidden, from light into mystery. The materials came from everywhere. Cedar from Lebanon, those ancient trees that grew in the mountain forest to the north. They were fragrant and resistant to decay. Their grain straight and beautiful. Hiram of Tyre had sent his woodcutters, men who knew how to select the finest trees, how to fell them without waste, how to transport the massive logs down to the coast, and then by ship to the ports of Israel. Cypress wood, lighter than cedar but equally durable for the floors and doors. Stone from quarries near Jerusalem. Each block cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar, the seams barely visible, as if the building had grown from a single piece of rock rather than being assembled from thousands of individual stones. Gold, vast quantities of gold, brought from Ophir and other distant lands. Not gold to be hoarded, but gold to be used, to cover surfaces, to create vessels and implements, to transform ordinary space into something that reflected light in ways that made people catch their breath. Bronze for the great pillars that would stand at the entrance, for the enormous basin that would hold water for ritual washing, for the implements used in sacrifice and ceremony. Precious stones to be set into walls and fixtures, onyx and sapphire, emerald and jasper, each one chosen for its color and clarity, each one placed with intention. The craftsmen who worked on the temple were the finest in the known world. Stone masons who could look at a block of limestone and see exactly where to cut, whose hammers rang out in steady rhythm, who understood that precision was a form of prayer. Carpenters who joined wood without nails when possible, creating connections so tight that the joints themselves became beautiful, who carved decorative elements, palm trees and flowers, cherubim with outstretched wings, with such skill that the wood seemed to have grown that way naturally. Metalworkers who knew how to hammer gold leaf, so thin it was almost transparent, how to overlay it onto wood and stone so seamlessly that the underlying material disappeared beneath the sheen, who cast bronze in massive molds, creating pillars and basins that would last for centuries. Weavers who created curtains for the temple's interior, fabric woven with threads of blue and purple and crimson, worked with figures of cherubim, hangings that would separate one sacred space from another. The work took 7 years. 7 years of careful, deliberate construction. Not rushing, never rushing. Each element completed to the highest standard before moving to the next. The foundation laid with massive stones, perfectly level. the walls rising true and straight, the cedar paneling installed, covering the stone interior so that no stone was visible, so that anyone entering would be surrounded by the warm, honey-colored wood with its patterns of grain like frozen rivers. The floor was laid with cypress, each board fitted precisely to its neighbor. The walls were carved with gourds and open flowers, with palm trees and cherubim, every surface given texture and meaning. And then came the gold, sheets of it hammered over the carvings, transforming the cedar into something that caught lamplight and multiplied it, that made the interior glow even in dimness. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was 20 cubits in every direction, a perfect cube, a room of utter symmetry, overlaid entirely with pure gold. Within it stood 2 cherubim carved from olive wood and covered with gold, their wings spread wide so that they touched the walls on either side and met in the middle, creating a canopy over the space where the ark would rest. No windows pierced the walls of the Holy of Holies. It was meant to be dark, a place of mystery, a reminder that the divine presence was not something to be fully grasped or completely understood, but something to be approached with awe and reverence. When the temple was finally complete, when every detail had been finished and inspected and found worthy, Solomon called the people together for its dedication. They came from every corner of the kingdom, thousands upon thousands, filling the courtyards, spilling out into the surrounding streets. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant, that ancient chest that had traveled with Israel through all their wanderings, from its temporary resting place to its permanent home in the temple's inner sanctuary. Sacrifices were made, so many that they could not be counted. The smoke rose in great columns, the smell of burning meat and incense filling the air. Solomon stood before the assembly and prayed. His prayer was long and thoughtful, acknowledging both the impossibility and the necessity of what they were doing. Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. How much less this house that I have built? He knew, they all knew, that no building could truly contain the infinite, but it could create space for encounter. It could provide a focal point for devotion. It could embody in stone and wood and gold the aspirations of a people who wanted to live in alignment with something greater than themselves. When Solomon finished praying, when the last words had been spoken and the last sacrifices made, something happened that those who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their lives. A cloud filled the temple, thick and luminous, neither quite light nor quite darkness. The priests could not continue their service because of the cloud. It filled every space, pressed into every corner, made the gold surfaces disappear into its gentle, overwhelming presence. The people stood in silence, in awe, in recognition that something beyond ordinary experience was occurring. The temple had been accepted. The space had been consecrated. The building they had labored over for 7 years had become what it was meant to be, not just a structure of wood and stone, but a dwelling place for mystery, a threshold between the visible and the invisible, a house where heaven and earth could meet. And in the years that followed, it would stand at the center of Jerusalem, at the center of the kingdom, at the center of their understanding of who they were and who they were meant to become. a temple of stone, a temple of gold, a temple of careful proportions and sacred space. Solomon's temple, built with wisdom, dedicated with reverence, filled with the quiet presence that makes ordinary ground holy. Solomon did not only build with stone and cedar, he built with words. Throughout his reign, he collected and composed sayings, short, memorable phrases that captured something essential about how to live well, how to navigate the complexities of human relationships, how to recognize what truly matters beneath the surface of things. These proverbs were not commands handed down from on high. They were observations, distilled from experience and reflection. They were wisdom offered gently for those who had ears to hear. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Simple, true, the kind of insight that seems obvious once spoken but requires real perception to notice in the first place. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. A reminder that wisdom includes knowing the limits of wisdom, that there are things beyond human comprehension that must be met with humility rather than certainty. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Not fear as terror, but fear as reverence, as recognition of something larger than the self, as the starting point for all genuine understanding. The Proverbs accumulated over the years. 3,000 of them, it was said. Some were Solomon's own observations. Others he collected from the sages who came before him, from the wisdom teachers of Egypt and Babylon, from the common sense of farmers and merchants and mothers. He recognized wisdom wherever he found it and gave it a home in his collection. These sayings were not locked away in scrolls available only to scholars. They were meant to be spoken aloud, passed from parent to child, shared among friends, repeated until they became part of the way people thought about their lives. Like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Each proverb was a seed that could grow into understanding if planted in receptive ground. But Solomon did not only write about wisdom in its practical forms, he also wrote about love. The Song of Songs, the most beautiful of songs, was attributed to him. Whether he wrote every word or simply inspired the tradition that created it, no one could say with certainty. But it carried his spirit, his appreciation for beauty, his understanding that the sacred and the sensual were not opposites, but different expressions of the same deep current of life. It was a love poem, a collection of love poems, voices calling to each other across gardens and vineyards, celebrating the beauty of the beloved, the longing for union, the joy of presence. You are beautiful, my love, like Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death. The imagery was earthy and immediate, pomegranates and lilies, myrrh and frankincense, gazelles and doves. The emotions were universal, desire and delight, separation and reunion, the sweetness of being known and cherished. Some read it as simply what it appeared to be, a celebration of human love in all its intensity. Others saw in it a metaphor for the relationship between the divine and the soul, the great love affair between creator and creation. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the best metaphors work on multiple levels simultaneously. And then later, much later, when Solomon's hair had gone gray and his years had given him perspective that youth cannot possess, there came another kind of writing. Ecclesiastes, the teacher, the preacher. These were not proverbs offering advice for successful living. These were reflections on the nature of existence itself, questions turned over and examined from every angle, the thoughts of someone who had experienced everything the world could offer and was trying to make sense of what it all meant. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. The word translated as vanity meant something like vapor, like breath, like mist. Not evil or worthless, but temporary, fleeting, here and then gone. Solomon had built a temple that would stand for centuries. He had accumulated wealth beyond measure. He had experienced pleasures and achievements that most people could only imagine. And yet, from the vantage point of his later years, he could see that all of it was like mist, beautiful while it lasted, but not permanent, not something to be grasped too tightly. There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. This was wisdom of a different kind. Not wisdom as mastery or control, but wisdom as acceptance, as recognition that life moves in cycles, that everything has its moment, that trying to hold on to one season and prevent the next from coming is futile and exhausting. The end of the matter, when all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of everyone. After all the questioning, all the reflection, all the examination of life's complexities, the conclusion was simple. Reverence, obedience, living in alignment with something larger than personal desire or ambition. The words Solomon left behind, the proverbs, the songs, the reflections, would outlive his kingdom, would outlive the temple he built, would travel to lands he never visited, and speak to people in languages he never learned. Words have that quality. They can cross distances that bodies cannot. They can survive catastrophes that destroy cities. They can plant seeds of understanding in minds not yet born when they were first spoken. Solomon's words were his most enduring monument, not because they answered every question, but because they asked the right questions. Not because they solved every problem, but because they pointed toward wisdom with patience and grace. And in the quiet of night, centuries after Solomon had returned to the dust from which all people come, his words would still be there, waiting to be discovered again by anyone seeking to understand how to live well in a difficult world. As the years passed and became decades, and the decades became centuries, the stories about Solomon grew. They stretched beyond what history could confirm, beyond what the chroniclers had written down, into the realm of legend and myth. These later stories were not necessarily true in the way that facts are true, but they were true in the way that dreams are true, revealing something about what people needed to believe, what they hoped was possible. In these legends, Solomon became more than a wise king. He became a magician, a master of hidden knowledge, someone who could command not just human servants, but spirits and demons, someone who understood the secret names of things and could use that understanding to bend the world to his will. The symbol of this power was a ring. The Seal of Solomon, it was called, a ring inscribed with a divine name, a name so powerful that speaking it gave authority over all created things. Some stories said the ring was made of brass and iron, the two metals bound together. Others said it was gold set with a stone that changed colors. Still others claimed it bore a six-pointed star, a geometrical figure that represented the union of opposites, heaven and earth, fire and water, masculine and feminine. With this ring, the legend said, Solomon could command demons, not to destroy them or cast them out, but to put them to work. The stories told of how Solomon used these beings to help build the temple, how they cut stones and carried timber, how they labored under his direction because they had no choice but to obey the power of the seal. There was a story about a demon named Asmodeus, a powerful being who resisted Solomon's authority until the king tricked him with wine and bound him with a chain inscribed with the divine name. Solomon questioned this demon, learning from him the secrets of the unseen world, the hierarchies of spiritual beings, the hidden mechanisms of creation. There were stories of Solomon commanding the winds, of riding on carpets that could fly, of speaking with animals and understanding their languages, of birds bringing him news from distant lands, of ants thanking him for not crushing their homes, of a hoopoe bird leading him to the Queen of Sheba. These tales spread far beyond Israel. They were told in Arabia, in Persia and Ethiopia. They were elaborated and embellished, picking up details from each culture they passed through. Solomon became a figure of universal wisdom, someone who transcended the boundaries of any single tradition. But underneath the fantastic elements, there was something else at work. The ring was a symbol. The demons were a metaphor. What the stories were really describing was the power of understanding, the ability to perceive the true nature of things and, through that perception, to work with them rather than against them, to channel forces that others feared, to transform obstacles into opportunities. Solomon's wisdom had always been about seeing clearly, about listening to what was really being said, about understanding motivations and patterns, about recognizing that beneath the surface chaos of human behavior, there were principles that could be discerned and worked with. The ring represented that insight, the understanding that gives a person influence not through brute force, but through comprehension. The demons represented all the wild, uncontrolled forces of existence, the passions and fears and compulsions that drive people to act in ways they don't fully understand. Solomon's power over them was the power of consciousness over unconsciousness, of wisdom over ignorance. In the legends, Solomon never destroyed the demons. He didn't need to. He simply understood them well enough to direct their energy toward constructive purposes. He saw that what appeared chaotic and threatening could be channeled, could be given form and purpose, could be made to serve rather than to destroy. This was the deeper magic, not spells and incantations, but the transformative power of clear seeing. The stories also acknowledged that such power was not without its dangers. There were tales of Solomon's ring being stolen, of demons being released from his control, of chaos temporarily overtaking order until the seal was recovered. These stories recognize that wisdom is not a permanent possession. It must be maintained. It can be lost through carelessness or pride. The forces we think we've mastered can always slip free if we stop paying attention. But in the end, Solomon always recovered the ring. Order was always restored. The metaphor held wisdom, once truly attained, leaves a mark that cannot be entirely erased. The historical Solomon had been a king who ruled for 40 years, who built a temple, who judged disputes and managed trade routes and wrote proverbs. The legendary Solomon became something larger, an archetype of the wise ruler, the enlightened master, the person who understood the hidden patterns of reality and could work with them. Both versions contain truth, the historical truth of a man who lived and ruled and thought deeply about what it meant to govern well. The mythic truth of the human aspiration to understand, to bring order out of chaos, to exercise power through wisdom rather than violence. The seal, the ring, the command over demons, these were the imagination's way of depicting something that was real, but difficult to describe in ordinary language. The transformative power of understanding, the authority that comes not from force, but from perceiving the truth of things. And in the quiet hours of night, when the legends were told and retold, when the stories grew and changed and adapted to new listeners in new lands, the core remained the same. Solomon had been wise, and wisdom, real wisdom, is the closest thing to magic that the world has ever known. Word of Solomon's wisdom had traveled far, south through the desert trade routes, across vast stretches of sand and stone, to a distant kingdom ruled by a queen whose own wisdom was legendary in her lands. The Queen of Sheba, a ruler in her own right, wealthy beyond measure, accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room she entered. She had heard the reports about Solomon, about his judgments, his knowledge, his understanding of everything from the movements of stars to the workings of the human heart. She decided to see for herself. The journey was long, months of travel through harsh terrain, her caravan enormous, hundreds of camels loaded with gifts, servants and advisors, guards to ensure safe passage through territories both friendly and uncertain. They moved slowly across the landscape, following ancient routes marked by wells and oases, resting during the hottest hours, traveling in the relative cool of early morning and late afternoon. The queen traveled not as a supplicant seeking favors, but as an equal coming to meet another equal. She brought gifts appropriate to her status, gold and precious stones, spices in quantities that filled the air with fragrance, rare woods and fabrics. These were not tributes, but exchanges, the kind of presents one sovereign brings to another. When she finally arrived in Jerusalem, when she saw the city rising on its hill and the temple gleaming in the sunlight, she felt the first stirring of genuine curiosity. Perhaps the reports had not been exaggerated after all. Solomon received her with full honor. There were ceremonies and formal greetings, the careful protocols that govern meetings between rulers. But beneath the formality, something else was happening. Two sharp minds were taking each other's measure, recognizing something familiar across the distance of culture and geography. The queen had come prepared with riddles. These were not simple puzzles for children. They were complex questions designed to test the limits of understanding, to probe whether Solomon's reputation was deserved or merely inflated by distance and rumor. She asked about the nature of time, about paradoxes of language, about situations where conventional wisdom seemed to contradict itself. She posed questions that had multiple valid answers, waiting to see which answer Solomon would choose and why. He responded thoughtfully to each one, not rushing to reply, but taking the time to consider, to turn the question over in his mind and examine it from different angles. His answers showed not just knowledge, but genuine understanding, the ability to perceive the principle beneath the particular, to see patterns that connected seemingly unrelated things. But he also asked her questions in return, about her kingdom, about the challenges she faced, about how she had come to rule in a world where such power was rarely given to women, about the philosophy that guided her decisions, the values she prioritized when forced to choose between competing goods. Their exchanges were not debates meant to establish dominance. They were genuine conversations between two people who rarely encountered intellectual equals, who were discovering the pleasure of being challenged and understood simultaneously. They talked about governance, the loneliness of authority, the burden of making decisions that would affect thousands of lives, the difficulty of maintaining justice when the powerful have every incentive to bend rules in their favor. They discussed knowledge, how it should be preserved and transmitted, whether wisdom could be taught or only discovered through experience, what responsibility came with understanding things that others did not. They spoke of trade and diplomacy, of how to maintain peace when neighbors were ambitious, of when to compromise and when to stand firm. The queen stayed in Jerusalem for weeks, perhaps months. She toured the palace and the temple, observing the systems Solomon had put in place for administration and justice. She listened to his judgments, watched how he handled disputes, noted the respect his officials showed him, respect earned rather than merely demanded. She saw that the reports had been true, perhaps even understated. The report I heard in my own land about your achievements and your wisdom is true, she told him. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. Your wisdom and prosperity far exceed the report I heard. Solomon, in turn, honored her intelligence and her questions. He gave her gifts equal to those she had brought, not trying to overwhelm or outdo, but to match, to acknowledge the exchange as one between equals. When the time came for her to return to her own land, the parting was marked by mutual respect rather than romance or regret. They had met as monarchs, conversed as scholars, and recognized in each other something rare, a mind that could truly understand. The queen's caravan departed as it had arrived, slowly, laden now with different treasures, but equally valuable. She would return to her own kingdom with stories of what she had seen, with confirmation that wisdom was not confined to any single place or people, with the satisfaction of having found what she came seeking. And Solomon would remember the visit as proof that wisdom, wherever it appears, recognizes itself, that the pursuit of understanding creates its own kind of kinship, crossing boundaries of nation and culture and custom. Two rulers, two minds, meeting briefly in a world that rarely allowed such meetings. It had been enough. The years continued to pass, as years always do. Solomon's kingdom remained prosperous. The trade routes still flowed with goods from distant lands. The temple still stood gleaming on its hill. The people still brought their disputes to be settled, their questions to be answered. But something had shifted so gradually that it was difficult to say exactly when it began. The wealth had continued to accumulate, gold and silver, so much that silver became common, almost ordinary. Storehouses filled with grain and oil and wine, stables that held thousands of horses, chariots that gleamed with bronze and precious metals. The alliances had multiplied as well. Political marriages, as was the custom of kings in that time and place. Wives from Egypt and Moab, from Ammon and Edom and Sidon. Each marriage sealed a treaty, secured a border, opened a new avenue for trade. Each wife brought her own household, her own customs, her own gods. The palace had grown larger to accommodate them all. Different courtyards for different households, altars built to different deities as a courtesy to foreign princesses who had left their homelands to seal diplomatic agreements. Solomon had allowed this. Perhaps it had seemed like wisdom at the time, showing respect for allies, maintaining peace through accommodation, demonstrating the kind of tolerance that kept a diverse kingdom functioning smoothly. But in allowing everything, something essential had become diluted. The sharp focus of his early reign, the clarity of purpose that had driven him to seek wisdom above all else, had softened around the edges. Not disappeared exactly, just blurred. The way a reflection becomes less distinct when the water is stirred. He still ruled, still made judgments, still managed the affairs of state with competence born of decades of practice. But the fire that had once burned in him, the passionate pursuit of understanding, the desire to align everything with what was true and right and good, had banked down to embers. This happens sometimes with abundance. When every need is met, when every desire can be satisfied, when there are no sharp constraints to force clarity of choice, the mind can become lazy. Not stupid, not foolish, just less sharp, less hungry, less urgently engaged with the questions that matter most. Solomon's hair had gone gray, then white. His face had acquired the lines that come from years of responsibility, years of thought, years of bearing the weight of a kingdom. His body had grown heavier, moving more slowly, tiring more easily. He was still Solomon, still wise by any reasonable measure, but he was no longer the young man who had asked for an understanding heart and received it so abundantly that it changed everything. Age does this, not to everyone, not in the same way, but it does it. The sharp edges of conviction soften. The certainties of youth give way to the ambiguities of experience. What once seemed clearly right or wrong begins to appear more complicated, more layered, more dependent on context. Solomon had not become corrupt or cruel. He had not betrayed his people or abandoned his responsibilities. He had simply become human, subject to the same gradual erosions that affect everyone who lives long enough. The kingdom continued. The routines continued. Life went on with the momentum of systems that had been built well enough to function even when their creator's attention had wandered elsewhere. And Solomon, in his later years, sat more often by windows, looking out at the city he had built, the kingdom he had ruled, the life he had lived, thinking, perhaps, about what remained, about what would endure, about what all of it had meant. The questions of Ecclesiastes returning. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity, not with bitterness, just with the clear-eyed recognition that comes when the end is visible on the horizon, when the full arc of a life can be seen and assessed. He had built a temple. It would stand. He had ruled a kingdom. It would continue for a time. He had sought wisdom, and he had found it, though wisdom itself had taught him that even wisdom has its limits. The night deepened around Jerusalem. The oil lamps flickered in their windows, and Solomon, old now, continued his vigil by the window, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient, unchanging patterns. In the end, Solomon's passing came quietly, not in battle, as his father David's life might have ended in earlier years. Not suddenly, with shock and confusion, but slowly, predictably, the way autumn transitions into winter, gradual enough that everyone could see it coming, inevitable enough that there was time to prepare. He had grown weaker through his final season. The strength that had carried him through 40 years of kingship had simply worn thin, used up, like fabric that has been washed and worn too many times and finally begins to fray. He stayed mostly in his chambers during those last weeks. The rooms where he had spent so many nights looking out over Jerusalem, where he had thought and prayed and written, where he had wrestled with the questions that kings must wrestle with in private. The physicians came and went, bringing their herbs and remedies, doing what they could. But they knew, and Solomon knew, that this was not an illness to be cured. This was simply time completing its work. His son Rehoboam visited. Advisors came to consult on matters that still needed attention. Priests arrived to pray, their voices soft in the quiet rooms. But mostly, Solomon rested. He slept more than he had in years. Deep sleeps without dreams, or with dreams so gentle they left no trace upon waking. The kind of sleep that comes when the body has finally been given permission to let go of its vigilance. Between these sleeps, he would wake and lie still, watching the light change on the walls, listening to the sounds of the palace continuing around him. Footsteps in corridors, distant voices, the ordinary business of life proceeding as it always had and always would. He felt no fear. He had thought about death enough, written about it enough in his later reflections, to have made a kind of peace with it. Everything has its season, a time to be born and a time to die. His time was approaching, and he could accept that. There were no dramatic final words, no great pronouncements, just quiet conversations with those who came to see him, simple exchanges about simple things, the kind of talk that happens when there's nothing left that needs to be proven or established. And then one evening, as the sun was setting over the hills west of Jerusalem, as the light was turning everything golden and soft, Solomon's breathing slowed further. The attendants in the room noticed. They moved closer, but they did not panic. This was expected. This was the natural end of a long life, lived fully. His breath came slower, and slower still, and then it stopped. Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, had returned to the dust from which all people come. The kingdom he left behind was vast and wealthy. It was also fragile in ways that would soon become apparent. The unity he had maintained through wisdom and careful diplomacy would not survive his passing. The nation would fracture, divide, begin the long decline that eventually comes to all human kingdoms. But that is a different story. For now, there was only the quiet fact of an ending. A life completed, a reign concluded, a wise king who had sought understanding and found it, who had built a temple that would stand for centuries, who had left words that would outlive empires. The sun finished setting. The stars emerged over Jerusalem, the same stars that had watched Solomon's entire life, that had been there long before him and would remain long after. The lamp in his chamber burned through the night, tended by faithful servants, a small light keeping vigil while the city slept. The stories did not end with Solomon's death. They could not end. Stories like his have a life of their own, continuing long after the person who inspired them has gone, spreading outward like ripples on still water, reaching shores the original speaker never imagined. In the centuries that followed, Solomon's name became a touchstone, a reference point, a symbol of what wisdom could be when it was truly sought and truly found. Jewish scholars studied his proverbs, debating their meanings, finding new applications in each generation. They told stories of his judgments, using them to teach principles of justice and discernment. They read Ecclesiastes and wrestled with its questions, discovering that the same uncertainties Solomon had pondered were still present, still requiring thought and patience. Christian monks copied his words in quiet scriptoriums, their careful hands preserving the text through centuries of upheaval and change. They saw in the Song of Songs a metaphor for divine love, reading the intimate poetry as describing the soul's longing for union with the sacred. Islamic traditions embrace Solomon, Suleiman in Arabic, as a prophet and a king of extraordinary power. The stories of his ring and his command over spirits became part of a rich tapestry of tales that spread from Persia to Morocco, from Arabia to Indonesia. In these tellings, he remained wise, remained just, remained someone who used power not for conquest, but for establishing order and understanding. Ethiopian traditions claim descent from Solomon through the Queen of Sheba, weaving his legacy into their own royal history, making him part of a lineage that connected ancient Israel to the kingdoms of East Africa. Everywhere his name traveled, it carried the same essential meaning: wisdom, understanding, the ability to see clearly and judge fairly, the capacity to perceive truth beneath surface appearances. But perhaps the deepest legacy was not in the grand stories or the legendary powers. Perhaps it was in the quieter moments, in the proverbs that parents still whispered to children at bedtime, in the reminder that wisdom begins with reverence, with recognizing something larger than oneself, in the acknowledgement that there is a time for everything, and that accepting this rhythm is itself a form of peace. Solomon's voice, or the voice that had been attributed to him across the centuries, still spoke in those whispered teachings, still offered guidance for the perpetually difficult work of being human, still suggested that understanding was possible, that clarity could be found, that the chaos of existence could be met with wisdom rather than merely force or fear. The temple he built had fallen, as all buildings eventually fall. The kingdom he ruled had divided and been conquered and scattered. The gold and silver had been plundered, or buried, or melted down and reformed into other shapes for other purposes. But the words remained. The idea remained. The possibility remained. That a person could seek wisdom and find it. That a mind could be trained to see clearly. That power could be exercised with justice. That understanding was worth more than any amount of wealth or military might. These ideas had outlasted stone and bronze. They had survived the collapse of kingdoms and the shifting of empires. They had been carried in the minds and hearts of people who found in Solomon's story something they needed: permission to value thought over action, understanding over conquest, patience over urgency. And now, in the deep quiet of night, the stories settle like dust after a long day. Solomon sleeping in his tomb, his body long since returned to the earth that gave it form. His temple sleeping in ruins, stone scattered, glory faded into memory. His kingdom sleeping in the pages of history, a brief moment of unity and peace in the long, troubled story of his people. But his wisdom still whispering, soft as breath, gentle as starlight, still suggesting that there is a way to live well, a way to see clearly, a way to rest in understanding rather than striving endlessly against the nature of things. The night deepens. The world grows quiet. The ancient story folds itself away like a robe set aside at day's end. And somewhere in the silence, wisdom waits, patient, eternal, available to anyone who seeks it with a sincere heart. The stars continue their slow wheel overhead. The darkness holds everything gently. Time itself seems to slow, to soften, to become something that can be rested in rather than fought against. Solomon's legend, like all legends, becomes part of the night, part of the stillness, part of the great, quiet truth that everything passes, and that this passing is not tragedy, but simply the way of all things. Rest comes, has always been coming, is here now. The story ends where all stories end, in silence, in peace, in the gentle dark that holds us all. Thank you for spending this time with Sleepy Legends and for traveling through the life and legends of King Solomon with me. These ancient stories have a way of lingering softly, like echoes, long after they're told. If you found comfort or calm in tonight's journey, you're always welcome back. New legends from mythology and history are shared regularly here, each one chosen to accompany the quiet hours of the night. And if there's a story, myth, or historical figure you'd like to rest with in a future episode, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single one. Until next time, may the night be gentle, and may wisdom arrive quietly just when it's needed.